Okay. How was life? Race? How was your race assignment? It's all good. No.
No. That was a lovely nightmare for me.
Did you? Were you having issues with the normal functions or with the class?
I had more problems with the review class and game info.
Yeah.
Assignment 7 class, that was easy for me, but whenever I tried to see whether or not it would run or work, it would not. I thought I could input the review into an array, and that didn't work out for me.
Let's talk about it. But yeah, basically you had because you can still resume, right? You had to create an array of reviews, but the array is going to be bigger for now than what you need. So you also need to keep a counter of how many are in the array. And that's basically it.
I think it was kind of like the sort of nested class thing that was kind of challenging about it, getting the
Okay.
hierarchy of stuff,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, kind of the step from the very simple class to now a class that contains arrays of other classes or something like that. But
Once I got it, it's like I got it, but it's more complicated at first, looking at it.
okay, today we're going to complicate it even more, of course. Now, and we kind of needed that to be able to do this. If you think about it, we said when we created classes, although it's not always true, right? That many times what you want is to make all your fields private and have only methods be public, right? And not even all of your methods, right? What does that allow us? We are only specifying behavior. We don't say how the data is stored. So if we ever wanted to change how we store data, we could, right? It also buys us this other idea. Well, could I actually have several different implementations of the same set of methods and use one or the other at runtime, right? Many times you end up with this idea of, yeah, maybe we should, right? All these things are not exactly the same, but they share things. They are half the same. And so I should have a way of expressing that half and then having code that works no matter which implementation I pass. That is the idea of interfaces. And this is very, very, very useful. So Java gives us the idea of interface. Imagine that you're doing a elementary school geometry program. Do you remember? In about 4th, 5th grade, right? You have to calculate the area of a square, of a rectangle, that kind of stuff, right? So we could say, okay, I'm going to have my rectangle class, and I'm going to have get area and get perimeter. And so eventually, and actually your assignment actually built the kind of interface that would ask the user, generates a random one and then goes and asks, right? What's the area of a square with side 3, right? And you have to say no. Does that idea make sense? So you would end up with, as part of that thing, you would end up with your rectangle class. You'd have get area, get perimeter, and toString just for fun. And if we were to create a circle class, right, with the same idea, you are going to ask kids about area and perimeter, right? You'd probably end up with something like this. I keep the radius. I have my constructor. I have get area, and that implements the formula. It's pi times radius squared, right? And get perimeter, which is 2 times pi r, right? Do you notice what is common among these two classes? What do they share? Yep, get perimeter and get area, right? They are the exact same thing as far as the outward interface, right? I'm gonna call it as whatever dot get perimeter and pass no parameters and whatever dot get area. Does that idea make sense? So I need a concept, a name for that thing, right? The name that Java uses is interface. And an interface is almost like a class, but all the methods are public. I can only have methods, the methods are public, and I actually don't write the method. I just say, this is how you would call the method. Does that idea make sense? So in Java, we can define something like this. Interface I shape. And this is not Java naming convention. I thought. In Java, it is not the convention to name your interfaces with any particular names. In C#, they name all the interfaces starting with a capital I for interface. And that convention I like. So even when I'm programming in Java, I call my interfaces usually this. Just because it makes sense for me to remind me that it's an interface and not a class. So I can define my interface I shape and say, okay, if you are a shape or an I shape, you are going to have a method called getArea and a method called getPerimeter. They return a double, they take no parameters. Now, if I were to, if you look at the syntax, it's similar to a class, but I started with interface instead of class. And actually, instead of having my braces and my method, I just put a semicolon. Now, in my actual class, I need to declare that this implements that interface. I have the keyword implements and then the interface. What this does, it tells the compiler, hey, compiler, I want to implement that thing. So if you see me do something dumb, slap me, right? So if you say that you implement that interface and you don't implement that interface, the compiler is going to slap you. Right? So it's going to tell you are not implementing this thing. Does that idea make sense? So let me actually cut and paste this code into my new project. Actually, I don't have anything. So let me do a new class, sorry. New class. Let me call it inheritance example. And let me add a main.
Well, can you say the interface instead of selecting class?
You can. Yes. Or you can just add the text file. But yes, you can. So I have my class. I'm going to define my interface here. And for simplicity, right, when you get to do bigger programs, you probably want to have separate files and each class or interface in its own file and all your packages. I normally put it in one file just because it makes it easier to talk about it. And we haven't done anything really big. So I can have my rectangle class. If I don't have this guy, I try to compile this, it is going to complain. So if I go to my problems thing, it's going to tell me. You told me that you implement this thing, but you're not. You don't have the method getArea. Does that make sense? So once you declare, actually, there is even one more thing, which is cool for kind of have the compiler help you. You could make a typo, right? And so it's always a good idea to do this extra thing at override. With this, I'm telling Java, this guy is coming from some interface or class. So if I do at override public void foo, then I'm actually not overriding from a common interface, and I try to compile this, it's gonna complain. Well, it's actually complaining here, right? And I can see it here, right? If you don't put that override, life is good, it works. If you put it, you're having one more protection against typos. Since you all type perfectly, you never need protection against typos, right? You never make mistakes, so you don't need the compiler to help. So let me delete this stuff. So once I have this, right, what can I do? And I'm going to show even more. What I can do is declare a variable of type iShape. At rectangle, I pass the width and the height. Now, that shape is actually referring to a rectangle, right? I created a new object, rectangle, that rectangle of 3, 4, and my iShape variable is pointing to that object. It's referring to that object, right? So by making my variable an iShape instead of a rectangle, I am telling Java I'm only going to use the methods from iShape, none of the other ones. Does that make sense? So I'm not allowed to call anything else on an iShape unless it was declared on that interface. But even cooler than that, and so I can do here system.out.println. And if I run this, I should get wherever is the area of a rectangle twice. Is this cool? Now, if I also declare my circle class, which I never did. Okay. Let me copy this one. And I declare that it implements said interface, right? Implements. This variable can now refer to any kind of iShapes. So it could refer to a rectangle, but it can also refer to a circle. And I can call the same thing, right? And it all works. Isn't this cool? Isn't this actually amazingly cool? Does the idea make sense? Does the syntax make sense? Yes, no?
Where is the body of the function defined again?
Inside each class. So this
Not
is
inside the rectangle. No, inside
the
the
circle and the rectangle.
rectangle. Okay.
You don't need both at the same time.
What do you mean?
The circle and the rectangle, you don't need both at the same time?
Yes, I need, well, I need the circle class, right?
Yeah.
And I'm defining get area in here. I need the rectangle class and I'm defining get area.
Right, okay, I see.
And I really only need the rectangle class here.
We can get rid of that line right there, right?
Then I wouldn't need the rectangle class. I'm not using it at all.
Right.
If you define something else in the rectangle class, but it wasn't part of the interface, you wouldn't be able to use it.
Exactly. I would not be able to use it.
But you could declare like a rectangle variable and use it then.
So imagine that I define, public double blah, get width. Okay, make it prettier. I can do r dot get height. I probably didn't make stuff public, right? Public double get width. They should both work. And I can compile this thing and it should work. I cannot do I'm getting an error. Tells me. iShape doesn't have get height.
It's spelled wrong.
That too, but let me spell it right.
Maybe that's why.
And you also can't use this stuff defined in shape for rectangle, I guess.
I can use the stuff defined in iShape for rectangle because the rectangle has all of them.
Yeah, it's in its own
Right.
class. Okay.
The rectangle has all of them, right? So I can do r dot get area. But I cannot do, because I don't know whether the shape is going to be a rectangle or a circle
Yeah.
or something else. Does that idea make sense? Even cooler than this, do you have questions, Akia? I can see the gears turning around.
I'm trying. I really am.
Can you vocalize the questions?
No.
Not yet. Okay.
Can you get rid of the last line?
Yes. Sorry. Yes. If I declare that my variable is a rectangle, right? The compiler is going to let me call all the methods of rectangle. If I declare that it's a shape, then it's only going to let me call the methods of shape, even though they are actually both variables pointing to the exact same object. You can do horrible things to cast objects to other things, but you shouldn't. If you're doing that, you're probably messing up. Sometimes you need to do horrible things, but normally you shouldn't. For this class, you shouldn't. I can do I can define functions. And I can pass an iShape as parameter, right? I can declare my parameter to be of type iShape, and then life is good. I can pass either a rectangle or a circle, and it will work. Does that idea make sense? Isn't this cool? I don't need to define two functions. I can do with one, right? This is kind of a not very useful thing, but I can also do declare an array, right? And I'm actually putting R and C, so one rectangle and one circle. And then I can do things like this. Hide. Cool. I can have arrays of shapes, and I can call, right, the methods on every element of the array. Did you notice which other method I called? Yes, that is magical. No, we'll see in a second that you can also inherit from classes, and the object class, which every object inherits from, has a toString method. So
In Java, you don't ever have to write a toString method, I guess?
you do, because the default toString method prints the name of the class and the address in memory of the object, which is not what you want. But isn't this cool? I can, by defining my interface, have all sorts of cool things and deal with them. How many classes could I make that inherit this same interface, that implement the same interface? As many as I want. Does that make sense? Isn't this cool? This is probably one of the most useful object-oriented concepts, right? Because you can use typing, you can use the compiler to help you and make sure that you call the right methods and things like that. This we use all the time. There is a couple of ways you can complicate this if you're really into complicating things. This was, by the way, this idea of I can declare an I shape, and at runtime, the right method gets called depending on which object I have, right? Is called polymorphism. Nice name for it is polymorphism. Dynamic polymorphism, class polymorphism. We can, if you're doing complicated stuff, and it's probably not something that you're gonna do for this class, we may end up defining several interfaces and defining a hierarchy. So I could define an interface I shape with area that just has get area, and I shape with perimeter that only has get perimeter, and an I shape, and I can declare it extends instead of implements. I shape with area and I shape with perimeter, and so it gets all the methods from both of them. Does that make sense? And with interfaces, I can both implement, and if I'm extend as many interfaces as I want, because there is no possibility of confusion. Is this cool or what? What?
So you don't have to declare I shape with area or I shape with perimeter again. As long as you type extends, it will include them automatically, I guess?
Yes. It's like, yeah, you're saying I have everything from there and my own stuff.
Okay.
And you could define your own stuff there. I couldn't come up with a better example.
Is there a limit to how many interfaces you can extend?
Not a given limit. At some point in time, the compiler will blow up, but chances are that you would get tired of typing way before the compiler will get tired of doing that stuff. There is officially no limit. As far as I know, they may have a limit that's like, they may have like 128 or something like that. You're never gonna hit it. Yeah, I would be surprised if they tell you the limit is just as much RAM as you have.
What about for implementing?
Same thing.
Multiple-
Yes, you can implement as many as you need. For interfaces, in a second we are going to talk about inheritance of classes, and on those you can only do single inheritance because it's confusing as heck what you mean when you inherit from more than one class. So C++ gives you ways of expressing what you mean. Java says, yeah, this is too complicated. Nobody ever uses this thing. If you're doing multiple inheritance, you're probably doing something wrong, so forget about it. And it's probably true. Any other questions? No, the concepts are reasonably good. The assignment will make sure that they're good. Now, let's talk about inheritance of classes. Class inheritance is very useful, but it's way, way, way overused. This is, oh God, it looks ugly. It looks ugly. Oh well. We can do something very similar with classes. Imagine that we want to represent people in a university, right? What kinds of people do we have?
Student?
We have students. We have what? What else?
Teachers,
Teachers,
administrators.
administrators, yeah. For some weird reason, in universities in particular, you have students, faculty, and staff. And staff are weirdly different from faculty, right? If you think about it, do they have things in common? Do we want to keep the same information about students and teachers? Do we want some of the same information about students and teachers? What kind of stuff do we want to keep that the same?
Classroom?
A class roll, would that be the same for teachers and students?
Course ID or course number?
Well, but for a teacher, if they are teaching the course, for a student, if they are taking the class, right, which is actually slightly different. What kinds of things do they have in common?
Well, basic stuff, right? Like social security number and, for taxes and stuff like that.
Well, yes and no.
Home address.
Does the university need your social security number?
Yes.
Why?
For registration, I guess.
Why?
Proper identification.
Identification?
Why? Do they ask you for the social?
Registration, you need it.
Yeah.
No, you don't. They probably ask you for it because every freaking organization does that, right? We don't care about your social. We don't give you money. You give us money.
Yeah.
Do I care who you are? You're giving me money, right? We do care about the social security number for faculty because we are going to pay them, right? For every employee, not necessarily faculty, also staff, right? Because we are going to pay them, and so we have to report that to the IRS. But we don't really care about your social, right? Actually, chances are that they ask you for it and that there are ways in which they care about it. Because to get in-state tuition, to get what do we call this? Financial assistance and those kinds of things, they do need your social, right? But if you were to enroll and say, I'm paying out-of-state tuition and I'm giving you kind of some actual money, there is no real reason they need your social. Does that make sense? So they do need stuff like
Yeah.
your name, right? And so that's the same, regardless of who it is, right? You may need stuff like your date of birth, or something like that. Does that make sense? So, given that I have no clue what they asked from people, let me define this class, and I'm calling it base person. We tend to call, when you have an inheritance hierarchy, the ones at the top of the hierarchy, the base class. So let me call it base person, mainly because this way I can keep all my code, because we have already defined a person class 7 other ways in 7 other places. And so if I call it person, and I put it into all my samples, this stuff starts breaking. So you could define a base person class that has a name and a date of birth. And dates are horrible in Java, but the almost usable date is called local date. Dates are complicated in general, and Java has this horrible way of implementing new layers of the same stuff. And so they had dates, they realized that they weren't good enough, then they created calendars, which drove me nuts, because a calendar is not a date in my mind. To call something a calendar when you're representing the date, just yeah. And now they have dates again, but since they had the old date, now they have local dates and things like that. So I can have my class base person that has that stuff, and put it into actual code. I need to somehow import local date. And I could have a class employee. And I am declaring here, it extends base person. Oops, what happened? Okay. Notice it's the same extends that we use for extending interfaces, right? Because it's very much the same concept. It's not when we implement an interface, we say implement, but when one interface extends another, we say extends. Here's the same idea. And I'm going to say that for an employee, I'm going to keep their social security number. By making the employee class extend the base person class, it gets everything from it. It gets all the fields and all the methods. So by extending base person, this employee class has a name and a date of birth. Does that make sense? There is one more weird stuff. In my constructor, I am defining, I am calling the constructor of my superclass. I'm an employee. Somehow, I need to initialize the piece of me that is a person. So this call to super calls the constructor of my base class. So in this case, calls the constructor of base person. Because I'm a person, the constructor has to be called on me. That chunk of memory needs to become a person. And then an employee. Does that idea make sense? Now I can have, let me keep this one. Instead. Oh, it's not person. Base person. much better name for it would be person, but then I get none of my code works anymore because I already have a person class.
When we get to developing like packages and how to put these in different files in this class,
Yeah. Would we? No. No,
I guess everybody does that differently too.
that is part of it. And to tell you the truth, I feel terrible, but there is a finite amount of time. And I don't think you guys would be complaining that the class was too easy. So I don't see how to add more stuff without killing you guys for no reason. So there is a bunch of stuff that I would love to cover that we are not covering. Just,
So if you have 20 employees, so you have to add that 20 times? Or instead of, can we bypass for example, Orlando is,
no. These are two different guys.
oh, they're two different, okay, I see.
Sorry. These are two different guys. One thing that we will cover is how to read from files. So normally you wouldn't actually type. If you had 20 employees, you wouldn't type them. You'll be reading them from a file or something like that. But I can declare, bless you, an employee has a name, even though if you look at my class, I didn't define such a thing. Where is it coming? From base person. You can see the good and the bad of this, right? Before, if I want to look at the employee class and see what it does, right? I go, I see my class, and it has everything. Now, it doesn't have everything. I was referencing somebody else, which may be on a different file, or right? So now it makes it harder to understand. Which is why, if you can, you should avoid inheritance of classes.
So the class employee actually contains two different elements now. I guess it contains a person and the social security number.
A person, yes.
Okay, so
But you're not putting it, that is slightly different, right? It is a person. It doesn't contain a person.
Oh.
Because I can actually do stuff like this. Declare a function that takes a base person and call it with an employee.
So could you just do a new class, and in that class, define functions that would go to person and get?
I cannot add any more to the base person class, but I could define class student what else? Let's do int here. Is that what you call yourselves? Or freshman, sophomore, junior, that stuff. You guys are weird. You guys are year 5 and 6 and things like that, but Why is it complaining? Oh, I need to define, yeah. The constructor, right? I probably want to do now I could have here and I can pass either a base person or an employee or a student to print name. Does this make sense? And I can do the same. I can have arrays of students, and some of the elements of the array would be referring to students, some of them to base persons, some of them to employees. Or sorry, I could have an array of base persons, right? If I have an array of students, I'm doomed. They all have to be students. If I have an array of base persons, then I could have any of those three in there. Does that idea make sense? With inheritance of classes, you can only have one. You can only extend one class, but you can have hierarchies. In fact, every class, by definition, extends object, the original class in Java. So if you think about this as a hierarchy, we have object, base person, and then employee as student. I had a drawing program, I could draw it as tree. It is fairly common and not good, but fairly common to have very complicated class hierarchies. You can also do you can also override I can have a class faculty and employee. I don't need the SSN. I may have, I don't know, private Boolean is dot, which faculty tend to concern themselves with. It is one of the weirdest things ever. I can call.
We can get rid of, that's a 302, right?
No, I still need to get it passed because I'm passing it to my constructor. I'm going to get rid of this, but I can override the methods from my superclass. So I can do add override. this is horrible, but you guys are not gonna. Excuse me of sexism, right? Should be Mr. or Mrs. and I have, but I'm not gonna complicate it more. And so now if I had a does this make sense? For everybody else, the get name for base person gets called. For faculty members, the get name for faculty members gets called.
Can you override operators too?
Not in Java. In fact, in Java, you cannot define your own operators. You cannot do. Now, on purpose.
I kind of like that actually. It's confusing in C++.
It is, yes. It's one of those things that seems like a great idea, and then it becomes maybe. When well used, it's great. When badly used, it's terrible. In a way, to tell you the truth, right now, I am kind of not against, but I try to avoid even class inheritance. When you said a professor has a person inside, right? In many cases, that would make more sense. Not in this case, right? In this case, if you have to, if this is how you're modeling, then that would be great, right? And it's different classes, and this kind of makes sense. I would probably model this as one class. After all, there isn't that much that we have, right? And even if you are a student, if you have a PhD, we probably want to call you Dr. whatever, right? So chances are that we model everybody the same way. And for certain people, we may not have their SSN, but for everybody else, we will, or something like that, right? So it may not make a lot of sense to model faculty, employee, and student, right? But
So would it be common practice to define a new class professor and then it contain base person and also have functions built into it that would be base person dot get name or something?
that sometimes people do that.
Seems like kind of backwards. I guess.
It's kind of complicated. I tend to go very much with English, right? And this is where computer programming starts becoming philosophy, right? Because you're talking about naming things, right? And there's only two hard things in computer science, right? Cache invalidation and naming things, and off by one errors. Naming things is really, really, really hard because it's philosophy. Should they be, if you're defining how you're gonna slice the world. So you can do all sorts of things. Kind of the most common abuse of inheritance is to have things that are not really subsets, that are not really the same thing, and inherit. Just because it's convenient, I can have those fields, right? So, for example, at work, we do e-commerce and we do warehouse and things like that. So you have products, right? And for performance reasons, we do the products get stored in databases that have all sorts of tables and all sorts of things, right? And so we end up with, sometimes I want to read the product, and sometimes I want to read the product and a bunch of other stuff, right? And so we end up with product with this and product with that, and sometimes they inherit from each other. And it's like, no, they're not the same thing, right? This is the product plus the quantity because I'm doing an order. It's not the same thing. That's not a product. That's something that contains a product. But it works, which is the it's the most important thing, sort of, kind of. It isn't, but it is, right? If it works, it's better than if it doesn't work. If it works and it's hard to understand, it's going to come bite you in a month. But today you weren't fired, which is always a good thing. Does this idea make sense? Yeah, I cannot. Yeah, right now I'm actually kind of going more into not even do class inheritance, so I couldn't even think of good examples of class inheritance. Interface inheritance is really, really useful. Class inheritance is useful, but any questions on this stuff? Do we want to create a new more example? Do we want to extend these examples? Do we want to extend the other examples? What do you guys want to do? We have, God, almost 20 minutes.
Just have a question about next week, actually. Are we gonna have, we're gonna have an assignment due Sunday again, so.
Yes.
Are we gonna have another one over spring break again?
When is spring break?
Next week, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, next
Maybe it's next week.
Yeah.
What I will do is have the assignment due
Do
after spring break. Yes. Not that the due dates mean anything to you guys, but I haven't been enforcing them, and I think it makes sense to, within reason, not enforce them. But the bad thing about not enforcing the due dates is that I haven't been able to post solutions to the assignments because there's still people who haven't posted, who haven't submitted the assignment. But
We have the grader test works pretty well for me, whenever I have a problem. It's not really a solution, but I know if I put in your values, it doesn't work.
yeah, usually that at least tells you whether it works or not. Yeah. So if spring break is next week, we are gonna skip. One would be good things to do. Let's go to find an interface that does something useful and implement it and do things like that, right? What kind of model, what kind of domain do you guys want to play with? Yes, anything you want to do. Courses, students, courses, that kind of stuff. No.
I'm only thinking about food right now.
Food, that makes sense.
That's all I can think about.
Actually, and that would probably make sense for class inheritance, right? Imagine that you're doing a restaurant, right? What kinds of things would you have? You're modeling a restaurant.
Menu.
You have a menu, right? And what is a menu, basically?
A list of foods.
So what do we use in Java to represent a list of food?
No.
Array.
Yes, right? An array, right?
String array.
So probably let me do this. An array of what? Something like this, right? Oh, what the heck's a product? Okay, that's fine. What do I care about the product? I'm going to be defining everything public just for. What kinds of things do I care? Size.
Give me a small portrait, and I will be very upset.
That? Yeah. Okay. That's. Yeah. Let me do this. Name. Let me call it string. Right? Then we can talk about better ways of doing it. But do we want to distinguish between, say, food and beverages? What would distinguish among them, right? One thing would be, right, to have here in type which may be what you want, and you may want to define an enumeration, but right? That's probably the right thing, but on the other hand, that doesn't help us with learning inheritance. So we are not going to do that, right? Oh, we would need to do what? How do we declare that we extend the product class? Then how can we distinguish between a beverage and a meal? Oh, yeah, we're not going to do appetizer or something like that, right? But here we could have string category. We could have stuff like this, public int type. And here we would have public let's do string. We should be defining enumerations, but for now. Now, what do we do here? What can we do to this guy? We could define some default value that says that's an error, you didn't do the right thing or something like that. Or we can define the method abstract, and by that we are saying, I'm not implementing it, my children will. That makes the whole class abstract, because now I cannot have a plain product. I can have a food product and a beverage, but I cannot have a plain product. Does that make sense? And so this would sort of allow me to have
On the beverage part, can we still add a condition,
what kind of condition?
like, if it's alcohol or?
Oh yeah, we could have public Boolean is alcoholic, right? And maybe public Boolean served cold or something like that, or maybe that's a string because there's more stuff. I normally see the hot or cold, but maybe there's more stuff. Maybe you care. Maybe it's more.
Why don't you keep Boolean?
Because there may be more gradations. We could keep Boolean. And this may be like, this is usually served at 50 degrees, right? Like, I don't know, dark beers should be served at 50 degrees, and then Coke should be served at like 35 degrees, right? And soup at 65. I have no clue. I come from a very warm place, so I drink everything cold except coffee. So for me, hot and cold is everything should be served at 35 degrees except for coffee and tea. But
Good coffee hot is good coffee cold.
I can drink coffee at any temperature, and I can drink good coffee and appreciate it, and I can drink really crummy coffee and still drink it. But yeah. But I don't know, something like wines, right? You're not supposed to serve red wine chilled usually, but white wine you would. So that would make an example, right? I don't know if it is the right example, but I have no clue when you're doing that whether it makes sense to just put all the attributes in product and figure out, right? Does it? Well, what if I do fruitcake? Is that considered an alcoholic food, right? I have no clue. Right? There's food that's made with rum. Is Banana Foster an alcoholic food? And depends on regulations. I have no clue whether they count it or not. So
Probably not. They took it out.
yeah, so I don't know whether, but would you be able to go to a restaurant and order a Banana Foster if you are 14? They may not serve it to you, right? So as far as rules and regulations, it may still be alcoholic. And so,
I could see how it can get out of hand, especially if you just kept dividing things up.
yeah, you need to find the right thing between I divide into seven, right? Now I have appetizers and soups and things like that. Should they be different? Should they be different classes, or should they just be that thing? Should they just be? We put category somewhere, right? Should they just be a string, right? And if you can, don't make hundreds of classes or something like that, because it's gonna make your life miserable later on. But sometimes life is complicated, and that's why we get paid the big bucks too. model complicated stuff. Does that make sense?
Can I ask a question? Just
Absolutely.
going back, just look a few places behind. The use of override is just to make like
The use of override, like here, right,
even on down, just
is to tell the compiler,
Yeah.
I think that I'm overriding something from my parent. If I'm mistaken, slap me. Tell me you're doing the wrong thing. Oh, there is one thing that I didn't mention that I did in here. It's mentioned in the notes, but not.
can we override anything?
You can, well, maybe. Most of the stuff you can. Now we have one more. We have one more access modifier, protected. Protected means me and my children. So private is only me, right? Not even whoever is inheriting from me. Protected means it can be seen by me and by the classes that inherit from me. So you can override anything that is actually, by default, yes, you can. I could do horrible things like this. If I do this, I'm saying this method cannot be overridden by anybody else.
Are you using final?
Final. And so I think this will now make this, yeah. This will now make this guy complain. But by default, you can override any method from your superclasses because you're not changing the superclass. You're just saying, right?
But by using the protecting, that you have to declare who is going to have access.
By using protected, I am allowing my subclass to be able to use name, the actual variable, directly, instead of having to go through now 99% of the time you're not going to be doing those are the kinds of things that is good to know that they exist, and you may want to go look them up when you need to, but normally, in fact, even public and private are almost overkill. They are a good idea, but many times you can make everything public and it still works. Not in this class, I'll point it to you now. Some things you can make public and everything works, right? So do we really want to? It's more if you're writing a library. So like the Java class makes the whole string class is not, is a final class. You cannot even inherit from it because it does all sorts of weird things to make it work fast. And so if you do it, you'll probably end up messing it up. That kind of stuff. But cool. Any other questions? Any answers? No. And let's figure out how to stop this thingy. And I will see.